that, underpin the electoral process need fixing. And I think this whole week and the past week has been all about why the parties are letting us down. The parties are supposed to be the filter. So can you imagine if the parties helped to filter the individuals who are running for office to yield a caliber of individuals who are going to meet the citizens in terms of the things that they desire. So I think that those structural things need to be fixed. And so it is political parties, it is the rules of the game, which is about the electoral laws. And I think it's uplifting to see the IEBC, somewhat late in the day, starting to sort of flex itself, and say that, the laws are going to apply, that we're going to insist that the rules of the game are respected by all. So if those structural things, worked, then I think in a way the question you're asking would be partly resolved, because then, there would be a benchmark about who gets into leadership. And so therefore then the citizenry will not be disappointed. There's only so much you can do as a voter. For instance, right now, when the ballot paper is finally printed after the formal nominations are done, you can only choose from that array of individuals.
Indeed. So let's talk about some of the issues that are huge. Working in the field of social policy, what do you think are the major issues that Kenyans across the board, middle class, upper class, and those who are not as well endowed in terms of finances, from the rural areas to the urban centers, what are the common thread of issues?
I'll name three, and I think that those for me are broad enough to kind of encompass the pressing issues. The first one I will characterize as human dignity. And we can go later on break it down. So I'll mention human dignity, I'll talk about human security, and I'll talk about inclusion. That those three things for me capture very much the things that citizens will be interested in. So in terms of human dignity, here is talking about, living a life of dignity. What does it mean to be a full citizen? Enjoying access to essential services. Here's where you talk about access to healthcare. If people are sick, they should be able to get treatment. And even before that, you should have preventative mechanisms to make sure that people live healthy lives. This is where we want to talk about education, that children should have access to education to the highest standards possible. We want to talk about shelter. People need to have access to housing, water and sanitation, food. These things are all quite well spelled out in our constitution at the moment. The Bill of Rights, everybody talks about the Bill of Rights, and the fact that it is very holistic in the sense that it is affirming our right to a quality life as human beings. So that's human dignity for me. Human security, I think, is important because I think right now, for all, I've seen the debate you're running with the candidates, and so far all the candidates seem to be saying security has to be high up there. My concern is that when they talk about security, I'm not sure whether they're putting people at the center of it.
That's right.
So which is why I'm saying human security. This has to be about, ultimately, about people, and not just, the conception of security that's about, crime. Crime is important, and we all want to feel safe moving around. But beyond that, we want a more holistic conception of human security. So I do not want to imagine that all they're talking about, for instance, is the superfluous war on terror. I want them to be making the links, and so that it's not just security for a few, security for everybody.
Right.
And then finally, inclusion for me is important because it's about affirming that we all belong. That in our diversity, everybody has a right to be there. Being Kenyan means that everybody has equal opportunities, and everybody has a right to participate, has a right to be represented, has a right for their issues to be addressed.
Okay, so when we take a look at these three key issues, which in and of themselves have encompassed so much, are you confident when you watch the various candidates on television, listen to them on radio, are you confident that they are addressing these issues?
No, and I think that we have to insist. Now is the time to start to say, spotlight manifestos. Tell us what your plan is. Not in, brief, tell us in detail what your plans are. And I think that the electorate has to also spend time and look at party manifestos. I think they're going to start, unfolding them. I don't know who has done. I think a few people may have done. The others are yet to do so. And when they do so, I think we have to look at those manifestos very critically and ask the question, are they responding to the things that matter to us? And for me, I think I'm going to be cheeky and suggest that I'm going to be looking out for somebody who can tell me what the agenda for Northern Kenya is for the marginalized areas, that would be a very good indicator, in my view, of the seriousness with which they want to treat the issues that are pressing.
Talking about inclusion that you mentioned, that everybody needs to feel like they're part of the country. Now that you mentioned bringing in the northeastern region of the country, you will remember that no political party conducted primaries in northeastern Kenya. We understand the clan system that exists there, but does it strike you as curious that political parties didn't go there and say, okay, you know what, we're doing this in every part of the country, why not do it in northeastern? We understand that the clans reign supreme and they're the ones that make the decisions, but we're moving forward. This is a democracy and we're not leaving you behind, in the past and how things were done. With that being said, do you believe that there is any candidate that is outrightly saying, look, the people of northern Kenya are just as much Kenyan as the rest?
I think it's very consistent with how Kenyan leaders have treated that part of the country, almost as if it doesn't matter, marginalized, completely. If you track public spending, and I think this is very revealing, and research has been done, the figures are there, people know what it is. It's appalling that you actually neglect an entire region, and even in planning, short of tokenistic treatment here and there, there isn't a deliberate effort to ensure that northern Kenya is part of Kenya. And I think that you just need to look at indicators, around access to education and so on and so forth. When you talk about, school dropouts, when you look at the figures, you will be shocked that for the whole country, it's about 18% in terms of, dropping out of school, kids not finishing primary school. For northern Kenya, it's close to 50%. So it just means that in terms of life chances, what are you saying to kids from there? I mentioned this deliberately because I'm saying that it, for me, represents a microcosm of what it is that is wrong with our nation today. Not only in terms of, an absolute lack of access to essential services because of neglect, because the state just doesn't exist, isn't doing the most basic of its responsibilities in that area. So if you think essential services, you think lacking infrastructure so that it's completely cut out from the rest of the country, if you think inclusion and the question you're raising about representation, so how effective is representation for that part of the country? How do their leaders engage with the rest of Kenya? And then if you think about, resource allocation, which is the thing I was alluding to last, will be very revealing in terms of if you compare how much resources have gone there and to other parts of the country, then, that would be quite eye-opening. And this, for me, what I'm saying is the ultimate test. Anyone who can crack how to resolve those deep-seated issues for northern Kenya, for me, will have cracked it for everyone, because you'll have, by one swoop, dealt with issues of access to essential services for a region that has been historically marginalized. You've dealt with citizenship issues, that you're affirming that they belong, that they're part of Kenya, and that all will be done to make sure that they're included. That if you do that, it should be so much easier for everyone else.
Yes, to do it in the rest of the country, in an area that is, harsh terrain and has been neglected for quite a while. An important point you raised there. Let's talk about family issues. Do they have any place in our politics? We watch what happens abroad in the West, and there's a lot of focus on family, on the wife, on the children, and what sort of man he is or sort of woman she is in her own family. And some of them say, well, look, if you can take care of your family really well and talk about inclusion and take care of all the children in your family, then you can run a country well. Is that something we focus on? If not, why? And should we?
I think for Kenya it would be a minefield. I think it sounds good in theory to say all this stuff about people who have family values are good people, but I fear that it takes you into the minefield of stereotypes. Because what is a family? Is there one type of family that is acceptable, even for Kenya?
So
and
is this
we know
an
that in
African
reality,
thing because of our different culture from the West?
Partly it's a cultural thing, because we know that family there isn't one be-all type of family. We know that we have single-parent families, we have monogamous families, we have polygamous families, we have the notion of the extended family. So that if you were to characterize, say you were to compare the way family values impact American politics, you could not import that idea here, because we have such diversity in terms of what family is. And in my view, and this is for me, I'm very liberal about this, there's no right or wrong as far as I'm concerned. And I suspect that perhaps a lot of Kenyans, maybe in the age bracket, my age and younger, will have trouble with this one idea about what the family is. You know, people who are Christians might suggest that there is a certain notion of family. But what about people who are, you know, Muslims or people who confess other faiths? So that, for me, I think it is a minefield because it puts us in a straitjacket.
But Atieno, regardless of what we define family to be, maybe polygamous, maybe monogamous, maybe single, maybe extended, shouldn't we be holding them to account for how they treat the people around them? Because we know there's some people who take care of brothers and sisters and cousins and uncles. We know there's people who have several wives, and not to say that the candidate that we have should have only one wife. Regardless, how does he take care of the 5 wives? How does he take care of the concubine, if you will?
Absolutely, if the issue is about character. You know, as long as the judgment call being made is about character, and there are many ways to gauge people's character. It has to do with the things you're referring to. How do you treat the people who are close to you? How do you treat colleagues at work? You know, what is your character? What are the values you hold? That is fine. And I think as a country we've gone even steps ahead. And if you look at the national values that we've outlined in the Constitution, this is what that was about saying what are the core things that we believe in as a nation that matter. Because my caution is about where you then go into the minefield of stereotypes, where then, say, women who offer themselves for leadership get judged on different standards, because then that is a problem. So that is the distinction I make. But in terms of character, in terms of values, absolutely, we need to be judging people on the basis of their character.
Right, I see what you mean. And obviously not a very level playing field, because I have heard every time a woman comes up, is she married? Why isn't she married? Is she divorced? What happened there? And we just sort of dig into somebody's life in a way that may be a little
and just don't do the same for male candidates. It never arises. In fact, in a twisted way, perhaps it is macho for a man to be abusive. You know, we do this ridiculous thing where, you know, he is a man, so he gets, you know, he gets to get off easy. But if it was a woman who did the same, she just would have no chance. The same applies to younger people. For instance, when the question about marriage is asked, if aspirants are relatively younger, because sometimes you find that people who are younger haven't yet reached the place where they made the choice. Of course, people who are older could make the choice that they're not getting married. It does not necessarily reflect on their character. And my point is that it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't fit the bill just because they...
So your advice, we stay away from this for a while?
I think that it isn't the most urgent of things. If you want to go that direction, then let's spotlight character and be very, you know, objective about how we judge people's character.
All right. We've just been talking about Northern Kenya, and we'll get to the other issues in a moment, but there's a text message that has come in here. Didn't leave a name, but we can gather from the SMS that he lives in Northern Kenya. Says, I live in Northern Kenya, and it's them who don't want anyone from the outside. Could this be because they've been neglected for so long and they just say, okay, you know what, we're fine on our own? Is it that difficult to include the people of Northern Kenya? What's the situation there?
I don't know if his point is that they trust people that they know, and that's, I think, a natural thing, that people start in terms of trusting those that they know. And if you're so cut out from the rest of the country, perhaps the familiar is perceived to be safer and you don't trust outsiders. And I think this perhaps isn't unique to Northern Kenya. I think most of Kenya behaves this way in terms of our politics, that we start by trusting our own, and we're very afraid to trust other people. And this is why we're getting into all these funny pacts, because you need ambassadors into communities. I think that that's of itself is fine, because politics is about interests. But I think that there shouldn't be interests that matter more than others. I think that if we are negotiating on the basis of interest, then all the interests should be put on the table, and then have the interests contend. And there shouldn't be a judgment call that, you know, some interests need to be more important than
more
others.
Special than others. Yes. So we're carrying on with our discussion, talking about the issues that need to be addressed. If you're not clear on that, hopefully by the end of our discussion you will be able to know that, so that as the campaign period begins proper and the leaders and the aspirants are coming around and they're asking you and they're giving you all these promises, that you have the clarity of mind to say, say, wait a minute, what about this issue and that issue, and how exactly do you plan to do that? Keep your texts coming in. We will be addressing them in your tweets as well to Atieno. So here's another one. Magero Vincent from Kakamega County, thank you so much for sending in your text. He says, I would like them to sincerely confirm that they'll implement the Constitution without tampering with it. Implementation of the Constitution, very important. How far are we as far as that process? What more needs to be done by the one that will succeed President Kibaki?
Great point. I think that people should no more be saying reforms. They should be saying how we're going to implement the Constitution. And in elaborate details, and I'm glad this is being brought up, because leaders need to realize that Kenyans are on top of their game. They know what they expect. So in terms of constitutional things, the Constitution has an array of things that need to be done. And those things include, the legislative agenda hasn't been exhausted. And in fact, because of the trouble that happened with the 10th Parliament, the kind of manipulation and, dilution and all these crazy things that they've done, one of the things that the incoming government has to do, and the Parliament, both houses, has to rectify and uphold the spirit of the law. In instances where they went and undermined this, I think they have to take it upon themselves, and Kenyans have to insist that they restore the spirit of the Constitution. So that, for instance, in terms of electoral laws, in terms of the political parties law, in terms of public finance management, we want a restoration of the spirit of the Constitution in that regard. So that's like one clear agenda, where we have to uphold and restore the spirit of the Constitution in instances where the legislative agenda messed that up. And then there's outstanding legislation on so many things. If you look at the schedule for implementation, there's a whole array, and it was staggered. So there are things that haven't been done. That has to continue to happen. And then finally is administrative actions. It's not just about the laws.
Yes.
It's also about budgeting. Where does the money go? And how do we allocate the money in a way? For instance, we were talking earlier about upholding human dignity and that whole array of socioeconomic rights I was talking about.
Right.
You have to budget in a way that is going to uphold and ensure there's equity in this country. Again, back to northern Kenya. If you're going to distribute resources, and I think we're going to look to leaders who are actually bold enough to say we have to have an agenda for redistribution in Kenya. It's not enough to say, we're going to just share resources. How are you going to share resources in a way that ensures there's equity, that there is inclusion, that people who've been excluded are on the table and are benefiting from our national resources?
Okay. And so when we hear them saying they will continue to implement the Constitution, and like you said, there's what they say on the campaign trail: we are the ones doing reform, and we are the ones implementing the Constitution. What exactly do we expect to hear, to know, excuse me, that this will be the team that has the will and the capacity to implement the Constitution? What do they say? There's a lot of rhetoric. What do they mean when they say, oh, we're reform? What does that mean?
I think for me now, I'll be very wary of anyone who just keeps talking they will reform. Because really, the credit for reform has to go to Kenyans as well. It isn't about just some leaders abrogating to themselves that, the reform is their precept. That's not true. A lot of reform happens because citizens want reform to happen. They're pushing for it. And we've done a fair good job in terms of pushing the reform agenda. Of course, it is not finished. But it has to go beyond saying we're going to reform things. We're going to start to have to ask the questions about the mechanisms, what specific things are going to be done. I just said it. In terms of the legislation, we're going to want to ask leaders to be accountable for the quality of legislation that emanates from Parliament. We're going to audit legislation, and we're going to be auditing legislation against the Constitution. Where shoddy bills are going to emerge, we're going to have to hold leaders to account for those.
So we want to hear them say how they will rally the members of Parliament, what laws will be passed, by when?
Timelines, content.
Okay.
So for instance, for the Bill of Rights, and I think that Kenyans have been very patient, since the Constitution was passed in 2010. People have been patient, the agenda was full and all of that. But if you think about the status of poverty in this country, if you think about the levels of inequality, people are not going to be able to wait much longer. We're going to want to start to see tangible steps to implement the Bill of Rights. And this is where, for instance, in terms of access to essential services, healthcare, we want an agenda around the delivery of universal healthcare for Kenyans. So in terms of legislation, you want to see in the next parliament, for instance, steps to actually institute legislation that will ensure we have universal healthcare in this country. That's what the Constitution has dictated. And universal healthcare in a holistic manner, including reproductive health. You know, for women, we do not want to hear that women are dying because they're trying to give birth. You know, this is unacceptable. This country can afford to give our citizens quality healthcare so that we don't lose lives senselessly. You know, an agenda for education, a holistic agenda for education that ensures girls and boys stay in school and that people attain the highest levels possible of education in this country.
That's right.
That education meets our needs for our economy. You know, that the education that we give is present to what our economy needs at this point in time. Unemployment, you know, we're hearing all of them talking about unemployment.
And Atieno, on that, when they talk about unemployment and poverty, they say we're going to make sure that the economy grows and that it's stable, and we have what they like to say an enabling environment. So when they say that, what questions then do we need to ask? So you'll make an enabling environment for foreign investors. How?
No, that's not enough. So in terms, for me, for unemployment has to be very specific things and specific actions. Saying you'll grow the economy is not enough. Even just dishing out numbers, you know, like we know what Vision 2030 did, forecasting and saying this level of growth will deliver us to this level of development. That's not enough, because we know that growth alone, if you're not talking equity, you know, it doesn't guarantee that the benefits and the proceeds of growth will be equally shared. And that's why our country has had problems. Even in the times when we've had very high levels of growth, that growth sometimes has benefited only a few. Back to the question of Northern Kenya, and that story can be the same for other parts of the country that have been marginalized. If growth proceeds are not being shared equitably, then you cannot have results that, you know, answer it for everyone. Unemployment, you know, you want to create jobs. How do you create jobs? I want to ask the question, how does government spend? And a very simple example, when government procures, say, for furniture, and we know that the outrageous story about how the Prime Minister's office was furnished. When you make choices about importing, say, furniture to furnish a government office, you're actually exporting jobs. So we were going to spotlight those kinds of choices, because we have a very fledgling Juakali sector. Nothing stops our government, and for us having a policy directive that says we're going to import, we're not going to import furniture. We're going to buy it from our Juakali artisans. These are young people who are very creative. We're going to start to work to add value to the products that they make. We're going to help them market their products. Add value, market it, create markets for them, you know, so that, for instance, if we're adding value to their products, nothing stops us in the regional integration processes from exporting to our neighbors. These are the sorts of things you want to hear when people are talking about employment. Because how are you going to create jobs? You can't create jobs if you're constantly importing and therefore exporting jobs.
Okay, so why do you think we're not hearing some of these specifics?
First, I think that there's an extent to which we actually just don't have people who are interested in a serious agenda. We have people who are interested in conspiracies. We have people who are interested in rhetoric. And because they falsely think that Kenyans do not want substance, they're treating us to this drama and intrigues. I think that we have news for them. Kenyans are able and are interested in the substance. And so they're going to be auditing.
But some would say that the ordinary average Kenyan doesn't have access to the information that you have, and therefore cannot, you know, adequately pin our leaders down and say, but, you know, there is this and there's that. And what do you think in terms of the general public and the access to information they have on how we have government spending, how we're doing that? Is this information that is readily available and we're just ignoring it? Or is it information that is hard to come by and therefore difficult for the average Mwananchi to say, I know this or I have access to this information?
I think two ways to answer that. Of course, there's an extent to which, you know, constantly sensitizing the citizenry to be more informed is something that should be an ongoing business. This is a civic duty, that people should constantly have access to more information and so on and so forth. But I think that we also, it's not true to say that people don't actually know. They may not have sophisticated ways of expressing these things, but actually if you are to sample views, I think if you just went out there and talked to people about the things that matter to them, And that's all they should be able to say. They should be able to say the things that matter to them. I think even if you went to the villages and you asked women, old or young, men, old or young, about what it is that matter to them, you may be surprised. I think it may be that they're saying, you know, we want our country to be together. We want a sense of fairness. We want equitable sharing. People will say, we want our children to go to school. We do not want to go hungry. We don't understand why in a country where you have so much wealth, you have people, so many people who are poor. If you are to go into the informal settlements in Nairobi, I think people will tell you that they don't understand this two worlds in one same place.
That's right.
So they don't have to say it in the language that economists might say it. It is for the people who are making policies to actually translate those ideals, those passions, the things that people believe in, into a language that can then be actioned through government action.
But when do they say this to their leaders? Because the typical thing that we have seen is, I think with the exception of very few like Martha Karua, who actually do door-to-door campaigns, we see a huge political rally. And there's people at Uhuru Park, there's people at Tononoka grounds, and he's standing there, this candidate, and he's saying all these things. And the public feel, so how can I then say what I need to say? There's not a forum. We don't have the small town hall meetings where, you know, it's a bit of an intimate setting. There's less people, maybe 200, 300 in a room. So people feel, I want to say these things to my leaders, but I can't get access.
So I'll flip the question. I think the onus has to be on the leaders to be listening to what the people are saying, and the people are constantly saying it. I think the rallies have their purpose. You know, they are blitz. It's showbiz. It's, you know, the appearances, it's the profile. And this is all about, you know, campaigns that are high level, at that level of, you know, it's really superficial. It's about show of might and so on and so forth. We have to start to say that beyond those rallies, and, you know, we can all be happy, we can show up and, you know, look at them and all of that. But after all of that is done, we want to audit and see who are the leaders who are listening. And I'm saying that Kenyans are saying these things everywhere. The ones who have privileged access to, you know, social media and all are constantly saying things. The ones who don't are either saying things through radio. I think now that we have very, you know, vibrant media sector that is talking to people all the time, and Kenyans are saying things all the time. Kenyans are saying things in marketplaces. Kenyans are saying things in public places. The challenge is for people who are interested in leadership to be listening. What is it that people are saying? And then, you know, actioning it. And reflecting that in their statements.
What would be the effect if we just said, well, we're not attending your political rallies. You come to my house and you talk to me and you tell me what it is that you've got.
It's all within our power to do. It's all within our power to do. You know, I was quite impressed. I had one of the aspirants on a show saying that he's encouraging people, if you go to a rally and you think that the leaders are talking rubbish, just walk out.
Away.
Just say, you know, enough already, you know, we're not interested. If you think, I mean, I think it's a very effective protest mechanism. If we start to actually assert ourselves, and we have endless ways in which we can do that. The rest include, you know, if people are dishing out money to buy your vote, take the money. It's probably your money, tax money that's been stolen, but make the choice. You don't have to link the two things. You can take the money and make your choice about the vote you want to, you know, to cast.
And speaking of the voice of the people, you've mentioned a lot of avenues. People are using Twitter, Facebook, and social media. But the civil society was also a vibrant voice of the people, where, you know, they represented the common Mwananchi and said, look, we're unhappy with this. That has not been so vibrant of late because, as many people will tell you, most of those who are in civil society now join government with the new wave and the new revolution. The place of civil society in terms of being the voice of the people, is that key?
I mean, what has happened to civil society in Kenya is not unique to Kenya. This is a natural trend. It happens. It happened in South Africa. It has happened in many places where transitions are happening. And it's precisely because what does civil society do? Civil society kind of fills a gap. You know, if you're thinking about neoliberal governance, is that they fill the gap for where the state has failed. Depending on the kind of progress you're making in terms of state responsiveness, and I think a lot of people refer to the NAC time.
Yes.
When the NAC government came into place. There's a general sense in which people felt that the state was going to be more accountable and perhaps more effective in terms of delivery, which meant therefore that even in terms of funding, the funding that used to go a lot to civil society groups, now that shrunk. And without funding, which is a big criticism of civil society that is externally funded, is that without funding, then they're not able to be very present. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it shows a level of growth in terms of our own, state and nation building, that we are growing in that way. Okay. But again, I wouldn't say all is lost. I think that we've just recently seen this very refreshing work that's being done by civil society groups, the court petitions, around MPs not paying tax. I think even as we speak now, the processes to insist that people who are not paying tax should not be elected.
Yes.
Those sorts of things are ongoing.
Okay, all right. Let's take another SMS here from John Serem in Homa Bay County. For the election issues, he says security for all Kenyans and their property, transparent and fair elections, losers to accept defeat, and the IEBC that is funded by the government should conduct the party primaries and print, the winners and the ballot papers for the main elections. Now, he raises some two key issues that I wanted us to address. Obviously, the major issue for this election would be a free and fair election.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I was going to say earlier that process questions don't cease to matter. It's all well and good to say we want this election to be about issues and all of that, but the way in which it is conducted is absolutely critical, and he's spot on. It will either make or break Kenya. Right. You know that last time we had an election, the country nearly disintegrated. We have not even recovered from the wounds of that. In fact, some of the effects of it are what are defining this election, sadly. So we have to insist that it's going to be a credible process, that it's going to be transparent. Already we've lost the battle on some of that, but we have to keep insisting. And the IEBC, we have to keep saying the IEBC has to do the best job, in terms of ensuring that it's a credible election. And this issue of people accepting the result, you could not overstate it.
That enough,
And the fact that our courts are now with reasonable levels of, independence and delivery, people should resort to the courts if they have disputes. If they have issues, if they have concerns, I think they have to channel them to the courts. We do not want to see violence as a means of, addressing grievances.
Absolutely. And speaking of elections that are free and fair, and that being the first step towards addressing the issues, because if we don't have that, then we know we spend 5 years complaining about that previous general election, claiming some people are in office illegally and whatnot, so holding us back from taking a look at the issues. Now, the first step towards the credible elections, March 4th, was the political party primaries. Give us your thoughts on that and the call to IEBC to conduct the political party primaries in future. They said they were just observing, which is, if you ask me, very vague and we don't understand. So observing means what exactly, and what are the limits and the extent of that observation. But when you take a look at round one, shall we call it, of that election process, how do you think we fared, and how do you think have we inspired trust in Kenyans that elections can be free and fair?
Before the verdict on the primaries, I think that this whole idea that as a country we're saying, let's learn from our mistakes, let's learn from our blunders is a good thing. I think that the consensus that is emerging, that going forward, primaries need to be conducted by the IEBC is the way to go. Many people have said it. We all know it works very well, like for Ghana, and it will be a good practice to adopt. In any case, there's a portion of funding right now, state funding, that goes to political parties. It makes sense, perhaps, to say we will earmark certain resources that will then be for running the primaries, and so that there's a certain standard of running the primaries, because it's absolutely critical to our electoral outcome. The verdict, I mean, many people have said it, these were totally unacceptable. No matter what the political players will say, no amount of backpassing, of them saying it was bad all around, so, why isolate a few and say, I think that doesn't excuse the fact that it was unacceptable. Of course, we will all move on, because what is the alternative? If we say reject them, what? Do we go into anarchy? So we're all saying we're counting our losses, but we will remember who's letting our democracy down. And I hope that even with the ballot as it is, we're going to teach a lesson to some of the people who have really taken us the direction we do not want. That choice rests with the voter. I don't think that any aspirant, any leader seeking position should be assuming and taking things for granted and thinking that, the vote doesn't matter. I think that let's surprise them come March 4th, that we're actually going to exercise a choice that is well considered, and that we may punish some people.
That's right, using the ballot, of
Yes.
course. Should political parties conduct their own primaries in the future?
I think that we should have the IEBC do this. There should be no, ifs or buts about this.
All right, that's how we create a fair standard across
Yes.
the board?
That we set a threshold for how they should be run. They're run by an impartial arbiter, and that then there are certain standards. And we earmark some of the funding that's going to political parties for running of the primaries.
Okay,
We just say that's the way to go.
that's the standard.
The other thing that we have to start making real credible steps on is campaign financing, because those things are linked. We have to say there has to be a cap on spending. Leadership in this country can't just be a preserve of the wealthy. Never mind that, crooked wealth is what is going to carry the day.
That's right.
We're going to have to start to say regulating campaign financing is important because it's going to define the outcome we get. We know that the 10th Parliament frustrated the efforts to have the campaign financing bill to go through. And we know why now. I think I was seeing figures being crunched yesterday about just how much candidates are spending. If you think between the billboards and the choppers,
and there's the
all
television
this,
ads now.
high-end type of
Vehicles.
campaigning, then it costs money. So what's going to happen to you and I who don't have so much money but have good things to do for Kenya? We'll just be, we are cut out. We stand no chance.
And also the question of who's funding that campaign. He who calls, who pays the piper calls the tune. So we should be thinking about who we're then beholden to once we get certain people in office.
Yeah, and this is not to say that there's something wrong with wealth. That's not the point. The point is that in terms of public affairs, there has to be a certain measure of restraint and control. And that money can't be the be-all. And also that we have to ask real questions about the sources of wealth. Where is the money coming from? And the thing that you're asking. I mean, in places where, like in countries where you regulate campaign finance, there has to be absolute transparency about who's funding whose campaigns.
Yes.
Because then we will know. If tomorrow in Parliament you're pushing certain agendas,
Bills, yes.
then we can make the linkages.
Right.
And you can be held to account.
Absolutely. So we talk about all of that, and every time we discuss issues, and we have the opinion polls coming out, and we have certain candidates at the top, some not doing so well. I have received tweets about people who say, well, this candidate is an intellectual and he's really good, but then again, it's politics and there is no place for issues in it. But at the same time, we're the same ones that complain that leader X or Y doesn't exactly serve my interests. Is it your belief that issues have no place or are still trying to just sort of fight for space in our political discourse?
I mean, there's no doubt that issues are relegated. This is a tragedy that we are allowing the issues to be relegated. I'm glad you mentioned the opinion polls. I think the opinion polls are very problematic in the manner in which we're running them. And this is not about the notion or the concept of doing opinion polls for elections. I think the way in which Kenya has embraced this use of opinion polls is problematic. Problematic because, again, linked to the thing that you're saying, our opinion polls are not about issues. We're not polling the aspirants on the issues or the platforms they stand for. We're actually doing a popularity contest polling. We're polling who is the most likable, who do we think is the most domineering, who do we think is very visible, who do we think is the biggest crook, if I'm to stretch the argument? Because if you unpack it, the popularity contest is actually about who are the most formidable ethnic kingpins. Who are the most sexist, if I'm to take it even further. And that has nothing to do with what are the issues that matter to people. When you look at the questionnaires, they're not asking about, what is your agenda for Kenya? It's just that if the elections were conducted today, who would you vote for? It's a perception thing, and the perceptions are really about who is popular and who is likable. This is problematic because it is stitching up the election. If our election is just going to be about perception that is profiled in the media, and the more you repeat a lie, the more it starts to sound like it's the truth. This is really shortchanging Kenyans. We have to insist. And then again, there are people who have analyzed the opinion polls. They're also problematic in terms of just the scientific basis upon which they're being done. The sampling has problems. The inferences that are being drawn are not being drawn. You know, for people who understand statistics, there's something very wrong with the sampling. There's something very wrong with the way in which the sampling is being done. There's stratification. So that then the conclusions being drawn do not, you know, tally. So it's not, you know, they have to up their game.
Okay, some interesting points you're raising there about opinion polling and just asking who's the most favorite, who's the popular candidate.
And of course, the obvious thing about who's funding them.
Right.
You know, there needs to be a level of transparency where you're saying, and this is what happens everywhere, conventional wisdom about opinion polls is disclosure about who has funded you. And we're not going to buy this thing of saying we funded ourselves when everybody knows who's funding who, and that the funding directly reflects the results. And for Kenyans, we have to be serious about this, because a lot of what happened last time, and everybody knows it, you know, the Kriegler report happened, a lot of analysis happened, and we know that the opinion polls contributed a great deal to the outcome that we had in 007. Because you set expectations. You set the country up for a certain outcome.
Result, yes.
Presumed, of course,
yes.
because we don't know until we've all voted.
That's right.
What are you going to do once this expectation that you have set doesn't become the reality? How do you go back? You know, how do you go back? So we have to be very responsible about this.
Right.
It's a shame that the regulation that was anticipated for the polling didn't get to happen. But I think we can't stop insisting that the pollsters have to be responsible. If they're going to apply this science, then they had better apply it in the way that science is done. Statistical analysis has to be done the way in which statistical analysis has to be done. The sampling has to be sound. The way in which they stratify has to be sound. The people who administer the questionnaires have to do it properly. Guys can't sit in hotels and cook up the answers for themselves. And you also cannot, you know, set up the questions in a way that is not adding value to our democratic process.
And let's talk about those questions now, not just asking who's the most popular, but we're now talking about the role of opinion pollsters in terms of shaping issues in the country. Now, the argument, and you know, we've had Maggie Reri here before, who's the MD of Ipsos Sinovate, has said, well, the Kenyans themselves don't necessarily focus on issues. So what it is they're gauging is the opinion of the Kenyans. But do they have a role in terms of shaping the issue-based politics that we so desperately want to see? Is it a role that they need to play? Because they say, look, you know, we are only here to say who will win, who's the most favorite, but do we expect them now to go a step further and say, okay, we'll be asking who's the most favorite, we'll be asking why, we'll be asking critical issues. Do they also have a role to play in terms of shaping the politics towards issue-based discussions?
Definitely, and I think that we are saying we're going to hold them to a higher standard. They're not going to get off easy, you know, saying, and they cannot insult Kenyans by suggesting that Kenyans don't want the issues. You know, there's something called agenda setting, and we know that, you know, the media does agenda setting. And what is agenda setting about? It's about the opinions that get put out there. It's about the information that is put out there and for the public to consume. And the more information is out there, the more it is profiled, the more it is repeated. It's like I was saying, the more you repeat a lie, for instance, it starts to look like the truth.
Right.
And where people don't have alternative sources of information, you know, people look up to the opinion polls because they have a certain role they have, you know, played, that they play. So they have to be responsible, and they have to know that we're going to hold them to a higher standard. And that standard is going to be beyond treating us to this popularity thing. And I like what somebody suggested a couple of days ago, that perhaps what they need to do is, for the polling on the popularity thing, that perhaps is better consumed by campaign teams for strategy.
To be able to tell them how they're doing. And
and really this is what it should be about. Because ultimately, and you know, occasionally maybe they should publicize it, but do a sound sampling and all of that, and run the research properly. You know, pay the research assistants well. Do quality control of the data if you're interested in keeping Kenya cohesive and not sending alarmist information or, you know, stitching up the election. You know, and then poll on issues. What are the issues that matter for this election? What are Kenyans saying are the issues that matter? Who are the leaders who seem to be very close to representing those issues? That would be a very interesting thing to poll about.
Okay, all right. Some words there about the roles of, or rather the role of opinion pollsters in the country. Let's talk about Chapter 6 and integrity in this country. Widely expected to help us choose the leaders who will focus on issues.
Yes.
And we know the controversy that has surrounded that. Give us your take on the alleged mutilation of that, and perhaps how that would be an impediment now?
Yeah, I think we are referring to the way in which Chapter 6 was legislated, so the Leadership and Integrity Bill. And of course, like with all the other things we've referred to, parliamentarians, ceased to have, they just thought about themselves and thought, oh, how do we save ourselves? And so they undermine what had been agreed upon.
Right.
But it's not all lost, because I like what I'm hearing from the judiciary. I think I'm hearing from the Chief Justice and others that they're very interested in upholding Chapter 6. They're very interested in ensuring that leadership is about integrity in this country, that we're going to hold leaders to a certain standard, that all is not lost. So I think that between the IEBC, between the courts, and between Kenyans ourselves as voters, we're going to insist that leaders meet that threshold. Of course, starting with March 4th. Starting with this nomination process that is formally going to happen with IBC from the 29th to the 2nd, that when they examine the papers that aspirants are going to submit, and I know that they're pressed for time, but in spite of that, we hope that the IBC is actually going to use some of those standards to root out people who are not suitable.
Okay.
It is within their power to do.
Absolutely.
And come March 4th as voters, let's also remember those benchmarks, the standards, and select leaders on the basis of those standards. And then if all else fails, if we still have crooks who have made it through the cracks, through the electoral process, if we have sufficient grounds and evidence to hold them to account that they're going against the law, that we should then still use the option of petitions.
Yes, all right. And also, should they be able to slip through, there's the recall, obviously, after the election.
So it's to say we have options. We have endless options.
Right.
So this is a journey. And we shall lose some as we go along the way, but we shall be reclaiming it.
Yes.
So let people not celebrate too early.
Okay.
I think Kenyans are watching, and we're very vigilant.
Yeah.
Eternal vigilance, eternal vigilance. This is how we keep growing our democracy.
Okay. Talking about political parties now, the spotlight was on them. We see political parties being formed during every election cycle, which in Kenya we're apparently in an election mode 24 hours a day, every day, regardless of whether it's the election year or not. But political parties in their manifestos, we alluded to this earlier, mentioned it in passing, but can this be an avenue where we say, I am a member of this political party and therefore contributing to its manifestos, which then we hope that manifesto will sort of be the same, shall we say, running plan for the government. Our engagement with political parties, can that probably help us to get the leaders that we want?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people that need to remember, anybody who's a card-carrying member of a party need to remember that they need to up their engagement.
How many of us do?
Yeah, that's
who are, life members of parties such as KANU and whatnot. How many actually actively engage in the party politics?
People actively engage, like in the primaries that just ended. There's a cadre of members who will be engaging, they will vote in whoever, and they will show up for the rallies. But I'm saying beyond that, in terms of decision making, and the law now allows it, we should be insisting that the parties involve us, as party members. We want to know how decisions are arrived at. If guys are going into pacts and making deals, even right now we know there's a lot of deal making around how positions will be shared. Members need to be insisting that they're privy to how these decisions are arrived at. We have to be insisting that the structures of political parties are actually democratic. The law allows it. Let's not be tokens. If, say, you are sitting as a party official, exercise your right and your responsibility to be an effective member. Don't be a sycophant. Don't just, follow the patron or the leader or whoever. You can choose to exercise that right in a way that is helpful. And I think this is the way to go. We have to do it. I mean, right now it sounds very idealistic, but I think that if we want to move our democracy a step forward, this is what we have to do. I think a lot of the hue and cry also from people about how the primaries were sham is also a cry about that. And hopefully it will translate into people saying membership in political parties is going to have to mean a bit more than just occasionally attending the rallies or donning their T-shirts or selling membership cards,
Yes.
you know, and so on and so forth.
That's
and has
right.
to be about shaping the content, shaping the decisions, shaping the conduct of political parties and holding them to account.
And perhaps if we start from there, then we can be vibrant through the political parties and talk about the issues that are raised?
Yeah, and as long as we are professing that we are party-based democracy, then we really have to do the work. We have to do the work to make the parties institutions.
Right, not just sit back and say that political party and that one, they don't seem to be saying the right thing. When we talk about issues, there's the issue that's raised about the middle class, and they're the ones apparently, rightly or wrongly, it's a stereotype I think that we've created, that they one, know the issues, understand them, two, articulate them better, and that people who are below the middle class, the lower income earners, don't necessarily focus on issues. Without addressing, you know, that issue of who cares about you know, issues more than the populist politics. If indeed the middle class claims that we're all about issues and we don't like this, why aren't they as vibrant as we would expect in terms of holding people to account?
First, just a small thing for me. I'm not even sure that when this term is being bandied about, this whole idea about a middle class, that many people actually really know what you're referring to when you talk about a middle class. And if you're to analyze in terms of Kenya, I am not even sure who qualifies as a middle class and whether that number is even significant to warrant the kind of you know, conclusions being made. I think people are talking more about, we're characterizing and distinguishing between poorer Kenyans and comfortable Kenyans and the wealthy.
Right.
And I think we're thinking that the people who fall in the middle are the middle class, and the people who are poorer, and here I think we're thinking slum dwellers and others, who we are assuming don't know very much.
Yes.
Very problematic. I think this whole discussion is totally problematic, but I also like it because I think it is forcing some of our own contradictions as a society to emerge.
Yes.
The fact that we're actually saying that the people who we assume are more ignorant and are poorer actually know what they want out of politics, for me is absolutely refreshing. And it is what everybody has known from time immemorial. That the thing that we were saying earlier, that do Kenyans know what they want? And when we talk about Kenyans, I really mean the majority poor Kenyans, the ones who are excluded, the ones who have a daily struggle to take their kids through school, to have a meal on the table, the ones who are really having it rough. Those people know what they want out of politics. And this is why, if they find a leader who they think meets them at their point of need, then they will relate to that leader and they will stick by him or her. I think the rest of us who are somewhat indifferent, maybe because we are comfortable and, you know, getting food is not such a big deal. Maybe we have a job, maybe we have decent shelter, so we don't know what it is to live in a house where you don't have a toilet, for instance, or where you have running water and so on and so forth. And so from the point of comfort where we are at, we have a hard time understanding that engagement that's happening on the other end. I think it is the contradiction that is in our system at the moment. It perhaps will force issues, because I don't see how the leaders who are invoking, you know, that they will meet the needs of the poorer Kenyans will get off. They won't get off easy, because I think they're going to be held to account. So I'll just give the example that everybody's talking about. If Waititu becomes the governor of Nairobi, you know, and I must say that, you know, beneath that, underneath the surface roughness, you can be persuaded by the guy when he talks about his passions for when land is grabbed. You know, he says, I will do it the best way I know how. I will join the people in reclaiming stolen land. I have nothing against somebody who will go out and actively work with people to say we will reclaim land that has been stolen, especially when you say the law has failed to uphold the sanctity of public land, that there are instances where you actually need activism. And this needn't be about breaking the law. This can be about reclaiming that which belongs to the public, that sometimes it takes radical action. So it may well be that actually the contrast is about radical leadership and leadership that is complacent. And it may be well worth us exercising our minds and asking the question, might it be that people like Waititu are going to be saying, my agenda as the governor of Nairobi is actually about affirming the citizenship of slum dwellers and saying they have a place. Wake up, all you comfortable people. Nairobi has this whole other, and actually, by the way, they're the majority.
Yes, they are.
In terms of the figures.
That's right.
And so that reality has to start to dawn on the rest of us, that this city is not just about, the people who have access to, posh houses, who have services because they can pay for it. This city is about citizens who are struggling to make a living, and they're not ignorant. Many of them are actually graduates,
and that's,
who don't have jobs.
That's right.
Who have found themselves consigned to this life of misery.
Yes, and there's a very fine line there between, having it all and just going into sheer poverty. And we know with the rising rates of inflation, it is very easy to find yourself in a place that you didn't ever expect. Let's talk about that stereotype, that the middle class are the ones that understand the issues and the lower income earners do not. But it's the lower income earners that bear the brunt of an economy that's not working. They bear the brunt of bad political choices, of bad laws that are made that do not protect them. But where did this notion come from, that the middle class are all about issues and everything, and they raise them on Twitter and, they discuss that, and the lower income earners just, it's all populist?
Yeah, it's what I said. I think it's problematic because if we have access to channels of information, and we feel that we are able to put our voices out there, and then we assume that with that comes certain power to influence. So this is the assumption. The assumption is that people who have more money have access to avenues of information. They have options, they have opportunities to express themselves. Perhaps they consider more than the other people, but this is the contradiction that's being laid bare. When politicians go out there to campaign, who do they reach out to? In fact, the so-called middle class. What campaigns do you think are targeted at you? Who targets you? Perhaps because as you drive around the fleeting billboard and so on and so forth, a lot of the one-on-ones that you're referring to earlier, the more person-to-person type outreaches are perhaps with the people that we look down upon, the poorer people and so on and so forth.
Okay, so as we close our discussion, issue-based, why? How do we engage with the political class and make sure that they are addressing the issues that we need to do? Also speaking to the middle class, as it were, is it enough to be on Twitter? Is it enough to be on social media and say, I don't believe this candidate has that? How can we take this forward and really drive the discussion? Because I believe in our discussion we've raised that it's up to us to drive that political discussion. In that way we can tell the politicians, you're not talking about the issues, you're mudslinging, and we will not accept that. But just advice on how they can do it, because I think the electorate feels a little helpless sometimes. These are my issues, and I may not be as articulate as Atieno or the next person, but these are my issues, and they're real and they need to be addressed.
I think one is that we exercise citizenship forcefully, and we have to affirm our place.
And by forcefully, you mean some people might be thinking, oh, force,
no. Not violently. I mean forcefully. And this is about, being heard and insisting that you're heard. You're not a silent, incident. You're not just, you're there for a reason, and you have power. And like right now, as we're talking electoral matters, that power is about the vote. And so no politician should take it for granted, that your vote is your choice, and your vote is your power. And so you're going to give your vote in return for certain things. That, the politician represents the things that you believe in. I think we have to affirm people who are speaking to the issues that matter to us. I think we have to run away from voting in a wave. And I know that this sounds very, like, do you live in Kenya? What are you on
idealistic,
about?
yes.
But imagine if you, I, the next person said that, and we made that resolve, that it will make a difference. This is how we are voting out every electoral cycle. The turnover of members of parliament is beyond 70%. It is happening because people are making a choice and saying, we're not going to vote leader X, we're going to vote leader Y. And we're going to vote leader Y because leader Y represents the issues we believe in. Leader X perhaps didn't perform. I think we have to see it through and take it to the highest level of leadership. That the choice we're going to make about president, we have to remember that there will be consequences to that choice. The kind of governance, the kind of leadership this country is going to have for the next 5 years is going to rest a lot on the person who gets to be president. And so we need to exercise that choice carefully and make a well-considered choice. The people we choose as governors, these are going to be the first governors ever And they're going to be in charge of a lot of resources and a lot of decisions about how things are going to run in the counties. The people we choose to go into the Senate, so all of those choices, the county assemblies, are choices that matter. And so we need to exercise that choice. It's not for other people to choose for us. We have to choose for ourselves, because we're going to leave the consequences of those choices. That's all I would say.
Right.
Exercise that choice. Know that that choice matters. That choice makes a difference. It is about you as much as it is about the leaders.
Absolutely. Atieno Ndomo, social policy analyst, thank you very much for coming in, talking about the issues that will shape the general election. It's not enough to talk about who's more popular than the other, who's well known, who's little known, who's lesser known, who is not known to the public and who is. But these are the issues that you want addressed. Are you getting them addressed? Are you holding your leaders to account? If not, then you have only yourself to blame, and we've been talking about how you can do that and what the issues are that we should be asking our leaders about. It's now 2 minutes after 8 o'clock. We take another short break right here on Sunrise Live. We'll have some news for you after the break.